Great. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. So again, as I had introduced, I'm at UT Austin. I also have an affiliation at Amazon, but the work I'll be talking about today is work done at the university. And the slides from today are online. The URL's on every slide during the talk, so you can get it if you're interested. So as I was just briefly mentioning, at UT, we have this big 8-year challenge where we're looking at responsible AI. And so a lot of things that are happening broadly at the university are sort of around this good systems work. So another thing might be interesting for you to check out. So I have a PhD student, Alex Braylon, who's been working broadly around complex annotation tasks. And so first couple of papers he did were on label aggregation. We presented those at the web conference in 2020 and KDE 21. Last year at BHCC here, we just presented an abstract on dealing with bias and complex annotations. So the work I'll be talking about today was presented at the web conference this year on thinking about annotator agreement for complex tasks. So if you're interested, there's a full paper and all the source code and data if you want to play around. So starting with sort of a simple way to think about an annotation task, if we have something like classification, is there a penguin in this image, yes or no? You might ask 3 people, 2 might say yes, 1 might say no, and you might wonder something about what's my level of annotator agreement on this. So for these kinds of simple tasks, there's really a rich history of work. So you typically measure this notion of the ratio between observed agreement, the percentage of labels that match, versus expected agreement. So if you just flipped a coin, how often you would expect pairs to match by chance, this sort of ratio. And lots of measures that are sort of out there for measuring agreement for this kind of stuff. So the space of work Alex has been working in is when we have sort of very large label space, free-form, unconstrained annotation tasks like this one, where we say caption an image, and there's sort of any arbitrary text that people can give in response. And the challenge in this kind of space is that traditional agreement measures that are based on exact match, just don't apply to this kind of data because when you have a sort of a large response space, identical responses are rare. So one thing I didn't know that I learned in all this work is there is a very general form of Krippendorff's alpha that actually can support this kind of data. So you just take a distance function. So in this case, what we might imagine just for simplicity is like edit distance or lexicographic distance between strings. You just compute the distance according to this distance function between all pairs. And you might see, here some are closer to each other that are more similar, some are farther apart. And I think, let's see, must have my snip in order. So I guess let's look at this, what this looks like for complex data. So here is some translation data. This is Japanese English data from Lee and Fukumoto. And so what we have here is 3 Japanese sentences, and for each one we have 5 English translations. So if we look at the distance between these pairs of English translations, what you can see is that English translations, pairs of English sentences that correspond to the same Japanese sentence have smaller distances, darker colors, whereas pairs of English sentences that correspond to different Japanese sentences have farther distances. They're these lighter, more orange colors. And so this is kind of what you want to see. You want to see these notion of observed distances, again, sort of between similar ones to be small, whereas these sort of expected distances by chance that you would get for sort of random occurrences to be large. And this is what this general form of Krippendorff's alpha gives you. You compute all these distances and you measure sort of this average distance between observed pairs versus sort of this expected distance for sort of random pairs. So the cool thing is, on all these different kinds of tasks, you can do this mapping because if you take any of these tasks, we typically have an evaluation metric for how we measure the quality of an annotator versus gold or a model prediction versus gold. And so there's all these different distance evaluation functions, which you can then translate into distance functions. So the question is sort of, how do you choose one and does it even matter, what distance function you use? So a quick example here is comparing for machine translation here. There is this GLEU metric, G-L-E-U, and you can see here that basically these English sentences for the same pair have these nice dark colors, they're small distances, whereas for all these other pairs, it's that orange. So this is like showing good separation like you'd like to see. But here's another example, blue, which is sort of an older machine translation metric. And here you see the data looks a lot dirtier on the left-hand side. So this is the exact same data, but according to the distance function you use, you're going to see different things about how much you think that annotators are agreeing by chance or not when you look at the data. So a good distance function should show smaller distances for the same item and these larger distances for different items. So the intuition then is if you think about Krippendorff's alpha, which is using this distance function to compute annotator agreement, that as we use a better distance function, we ought to see higher annotator agreement scores with Krippendorff, and we don't. So the question then is why? Why don't we see that? So here are two distributions, synthetic distributions, a toy example. So we have the observed distance in the sort of blue violet and the expected distance in orange, and their overlap is shown in that dark color. And for these two different distributions, the mean is shown by these vertical lines. So you can see in these two distributions, they're very different. The top distribution has a lot of overlap between there. You know, you'd say a lot of the observed things that you're seeing are overlapping a lot with just random chance. Whereas in the bottom distribution, you know, the distributions are very peaked, they're very well separated. And the thing that you would think here again is less overlap should result in a higher annotator agreement score. But both of these yield identical Krippendorff. And the deal is that Krippendorff is only looking at the means of the distributions between observed and expected annotations. So that's the main limitation here. So what we proposed in the paper is actually a couple of versions, but this is the simplest version. So Kolmogorov-Smirnov test is a standard test you can do to see whether two sets of samples are drawn from the same but some unknown probability distribution. You can go to SciPy and just pull it out of the stats module there. And so what we'll do here then is instead of looking again at these means of distributions, we'll get the distributions of distances for observed and expected, and then we'll do this Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to see. And so according to Krippendorff, you can see, for example, these two distributions have the exact same Krippendorff alpha score. But when we do this Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, it's much more what we expect. We see low agreement on the left-hand side and high agreement on the right-hand side. And so in this work that Alex has done, what's really nice is, again, he's sort of gone over lots of different annotation tasks and lots of different distance functions to kind of benchmark this stuff. And it's pretty robust. I think I'm just going to show a couple examples in this talk today for time. But again, here is this example of Japanese English translation I've been running on here today. And so you sort of see at the left side, we have this Levenshtein distance, sort of the weakest distant function. They really can't tell things apart very well. Where you go all the way to the right-hand side, and we're looking at sort of a semantic embedding, more recent proposal, BERT score, where you see things look much more separated. And again, so we look at Krippendorff as sort of the baseline here. You do see a difference if you look from Levenshtein versus BERT score. But when you look sort of, oh, sorry, I think I'm saying this backwards. We have Kolmogorov-Smirnov is ours. So we are seeing this nice trend that it's getting better as you go from the better distance function up. But when we look at alpha, we don't see that as much. And the two middle, blue and glue, seem to get worse Krippendorff alpha scores than Levenshtein, which is sort of not what you expect, or not sort of different from one another, even though when we looked at that distance matrix, we really saw that difference in coloring. So another thing to think about is interpretation. So with annotator agreement measures, if you go to Wikipedia page for your favorite one, they'll typically have some rule of thumb where they tell you something about whether data is reliable or not, or how much you should trust it based on this interpretation. So if you look at standard Krippendorff alpha, which is from content analysis, they have these sort of thresholds that people talk about, which is that if your data is sort of in this middling range, you can maybe draw tentative conclusions, or 0.667 is the lowest conceivable limit by which you might think your data is good. But the problem is, again, that with this general form of Krippendorff's alpha, the results you're going to get with Krippendorff are going to vary a lot based on what's the distance function being used. And so it's hard to think about that there's no real standard interpretation about what this data means in the same way that we're used to thinking about, I think, with general measures. So in the paper, we see that the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test seems to be more stable across distance functions and tasks. But I'd say it's sort of tentative, which is why I'm saying seems here, I think. So really, we think sort of more study is needed to investigate that further. So that's where I'm going to wrap up. I tried to really just keep the slides short, but happy to talk about anything more for the talk today. So again, this is this work where we really, this is the first evaluation that we're aware of where people have really tried to benchmark annotator agreement across a diverse set of tasks and real data. So the main prior work that we drew on when we looked at this was, there's some studies like, say, looking at paraphrase, where a couple people had done stuff with Krippendorf on specific tasks, but there wasn't any benchmarking across tasks that we could find. Or there's some really nice work where people had a corpus shuffling tool where they had generated a lot of synthetic data, and they'd seen for synthetic data something about you know, how Krippendorf was behaving. But there wasn't this, again, this look at really broadly benchmarking across a bunch of different tasks, as well as trying to look at sort of a combination of real and synthetic data, as well as proposing something we could do better. So for complex tasks, again, this main idea is we just want to convert these complex tasks to distances. The choice of distance function does matter. And that's a place where I think I left it out for this version of the talk, but thinking about things like metric learning is a space where we might try to learn distance functions that are going to be more appropriate, and we have some ideas about, you know, how you might optimize those based on this sort of agreement you'd expect. And in general, you know, the cool thing about this, again, this Kolmogorov-Smirnov test is you can grab our code if you want, but you can just go to SciPy and just pull it out and use it directly, as long as you just take your favorite distance function and convert your annotations to distances. Yeah, one last plug, you know, again, I'll put in is when we started this work, you know, generally around looking at complex annotations, you know, we always thought that if you have some particular task you're really interested in, you'll probably be better off having some, you know, bespoke method to deal with it. But the idea is at least you should start with something general and see how far it takes you before you customize your own thing. We've been surprised at actually seeing this sort of general hammer actually beats a number of the bespoke things that we hadn't expected. And then I can also say, you know, from being at Amazon, you know, I can say that if you're trying to support customers who have 1,000 different tasks they're trying to do, trying to maintain and run 1,000 different models isn't very tractable. And so that's also a place where you can think about dealing with this stuff in practice. Having general models is really much more important. So yeah, thanks.